Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Nice to see so many familiar faces. We'll start off with a silent meditation. So if you could please sit in your chair with your back straight, your shoulders relaxed, and your feet squarely on the floor. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadats, namadats. So see some new faces. Welcome, everybody. We're going to be chanting the Juni Rai. So we have the PDF in the downloads. And I will be chanting this a little quicker tonight. Because it's a little bit of a longer sutra. So please try to keep up with me with the pace, please. Genshu Tennin Shokugyo Amida Senjo Zokuson Zaihi Mimyo Andako Muryo Bushi Shui Nyu Konjiki Shinjo Nyosen no Shama Tagyo Nyozobu Ryomoku Jonyaku Shorenge Koga Chorai Midason Menzen Enjo Nyomangatsu Iko Yunyo Sennichigatsu Shonyo Kenku Kushira Koga Chorai Midason Kwannon Chodai Kwan Juju Shuju Myosho Hoshogon Nobuku Gedo Makyoman Koga Chorai Midason Mubi Muku Koshojo Shutoku Kyoketsu Nyokoku Shosadi Yakutoku Jizai Koga Chorai Midason Jippo Myomo Bosashu Muryo Shoma Josandan Isho Shugyaku Ganrikiju Koga Chorai Midason Ontai Hoken Chishoke Zengon Shoujo Myodai Za おひざじょにょせんのほがちょらいみだそん実法将来勝負し権限人図しやな戦後草原上苦行子が将来みだそん小無常無我と薬女水月伝女老一生説法無名字子が将来みだそん一尊不説無悪名薬無如に悪道不主任心身表非尊子が将来みだそん一尊無料法勉強無少種悪知識往生不快死菩提子が将来みだそんが説非尊苦毒寺修善無変如海水小逆前言小乗者摂取上小意法ナマダムナマダムナマダムナマダムナマダムナマダム願にしく読平等聖祭同発菩提心往生なおNamadats, namadats, 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 namadats. Well, good evening, everyone. Can you believe that it's already June? Time just seems to be marching very quickly. We're coming into the Obon Dori season, which the temples will be able to have their Obon Dori festivals where we get together to dance. And for us that are lucky enough to be in the Eastern District, we've got several temples that we can go to. And for those that might not be aware that the Seabrook Temple is the temple that has all of the taiko groups from the Eastern District, from Ekoji, Midwest, and New York. So it's a very special event if you can make it, and it's also in the countryside. So if you have the opportunity to come, especially to the Seabrook Obon, please do so. I was talking to Michael before we started the service tonight, And here in New York, obviously, we're in Upper West Side Manhattan. We do not have any grounds. For those that might have seen a picture of our temple or our church, excuse me, you can see that we have the statue of Shinran Shonin out front, but we do not have the space to do the dancing. And so traditionally we go to a different city park. And with everything else after the post-pandemic, things are not the same. So we would pay a certain amount of money to be able to utilize the city park for the Obondori. And we found out just last week that now they want to charge us over $50,000 to do Obondori. So I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe we can all get on the bus and go down to Seabrook and do Obondori together. But it might be nice because we're going to look into actually maybe having the street closed off in front of the New York church here next year, where we'd be able to have the Obon here, and it would be right in front of the statue of Shinran, and then we'd be able to have people come into the temple. But life is always in constant change. That's what we talk about in Buddhism, and going from $5,000 to over $50,000, over $60,000. It's like, yeah. So tonight, what I'd like to do is I'd like to do a reflection. One of the things that we do when we talk about in Jodo Shinshu is that the minister or the guest speaker or the lay speaker who gets up on a Sunday service or at any other time, and then we give what we call generically a Dharma talk. And as we know, Dharma means the teachings of the Buddha. But there's different levels of Dharma talks. So for myself that went through the Institute of Buddhist Studies and I have the Kaikyoshi status, is that I can give what they call a Hoa, which is the formal Dharma talk that our head temple in Kyoto, the Honganji, encourages. And these Dharma talks, I don't do often because they're a little on the dry side. You usually take doctrinal basis, and you do a quotation, and then you analyze it. And you can understand by my description is why we don't do that very often in the BCA. We tend to do talks that are more relevant to how they relate to our everyday life. And that's what I would like to do tonight, because this last weekend here in New York was a very busy weekend again. I'm realizing that every weekend in New York is always busy, but we were very fortunate. We did have the BCA National Board meeting on Saturday. And just for those, I would like to share just a little bit, because a lot of times people say, well, what is the BCA and what does that mean? And so that's our national organization. And we have 60 temples in the mainland United States. Hawaii and Canada are separate districts. They have their own organization, but we have temples. And as you will know, in the Eastern District, it's Ekoji, New York, Seabrook, and Midwest are the temples in that district. So twice a year, we get together for a national board meeting, this time virtually, where we have the representatives from the district and the Kyokucho, which means the minister representing the district. And it's a business meeting for 6 hours. And so we talk about the business of what's going on in the BCA. And I just want to share nothing specifically in detail, but the idea is that we do have the time where we talk about propagation. We talk about how can we do outreach to the Sangha in a way that might be more relevant to people living in the 21st century, social media, all these different types of events. And I'm pleasantly surprised that, we have a music department. We actually increased the amount of committees that they have. So one of the newest committees, we have an art committee, we have a music committee, all these different ways of trying to do outreach. And pleasantly to share with you is that the youth group, meaning that the high school kids, are formalizing having it reformed on the national level for the BCA. So there's a lot of good things going on at the BCA level. And fortunately for you, you did not have to sit through a 6-hour meeting like I did. Being in Zoom, it's like, okay, I think I need to leave the room for a minute, so put the camera on. But it is nice to see the enthusiasm and seeing my Dharma friends from all over the United States. And that's what I want to refer to on my talk, because the other part for me here in the New York Buddhist Church was that I had a long-term Dharma friend. And for those of us that have been in the community, and I know several of the faces I can recognize on the screen have been part of your local Sangha or a different Sangha for many years. And when I refer to Dharma friends, these are people that I have met through the temples or the churches. But most importantly, when I say Dharma friends, is that we share the Dharma with each other, we share each other's lives. And I've been very fortunate to have had many Dharma friends over the years. And one of my friends reappeared. So Reverend Dr. Kenji Akahoshi, who is a retired minister, came and gave a guest speaking. He was our guest speaker here last Sunday. So Dr. Akahoshi and I go way back over 30 years, going back to when I was a member of the Seattle Temple. And I remember being very impressed with him. So Dr. Akahoshi, when I did his introduction to him this weekend, there's things about his life that I didn't know. So Reverend Akahoshi is older than myself and is retired. So he had a dental practice for well over 40 years. I'm very fortunate because when I was going to the Institute of Buddhist Studies and I had a crown fall out, Dr. Akahoshi was able to put it back in for me. So on a very practical level, he helped me with that. But also over the years, our lives have kind of run a kind of a parallel. He's a little older than I am, but we're both saying, well, we love Jodo Shinshu, we love the teachings of the Buddha, but how do I, as a person, how can I help? Do I want to become a minister? Should I become a minister? And so through these experiences and our paths kind of edging, going back and forth like this, it was a great reflection on this weekend when we got to sit down and talk about it. Now, I have not seen him in probably 8 years since he was the minister in San Diego. And I also had another pleasant experience this weekend because he gave a workshop, which was virtual at Ekoji, and I saw Reverend Laverne Amori, our former president, and the person that I encouraged to go through Tokudo. It was wonderful to see Laverne. And of course, she served and still is serving the San Diego Temple. So Reverend Akahoshi and I spent the weekend. I would take him out to dinner. The funny thing is he's not a foodie. And so it's like, New York is such a great place to eat. Well, what kind of food do you want? Do you want to go, do you want Asian? Do you want this? And he goes, oh, I just want a sandwich. I'm like, oh, come on. You're in New York. Don't you want to do a little bit of experimentation? And he goes, no, it's okay. So, but I enjoyed his company, needless to say. And we reflected upon how we first met. Is that, like I said, he has actually a master's degree in transpersonal psychology. And many of you know that my background is also in the psychological field. And so he would come and he would do workshops. And he would come every other year to Seattle, and we would go to a retreat site called Golden Bar, which was out in the Cascade Mountains, a beautiful drive, about 2-hour drive from Seattle. And we would have these retreats. And so Kenji would talk about the Dharma through his perspective, which was very modern. And I enjoyed it. So I remember having the first retreat with him and then having the second retreat with him. And at the second retreat, which was just a couple of years later, my mother had passed just 4 or 5 days before the retreat was supposed to start. And so I thought, oh, I don't know if I want to do this. And I went, and I'm very glad that I did, because he was very supportive, but also, again, his interpretation of the Buddhist teachings were very relevant and is what I needed to hear at that time. Now, why I'm bringing this up is that a lot of times when I have people that ask about Jodo Shinshu Buddhism and how it's similar to other schools of Buddhism and maybe how it has some nuances or some things that are different than other schools of Buddhism, one of the things that I emphasize is that Jodo Shinshu is a path, that is a path to spiritual liberation. It's a path for us to trying to incorporate Buddhist teachings into our everyday lives. And it's not something that happens to us necessarily very quickly. I know, and I've told many of you before, that like many of you, when I first encouraged the Buddhist teachings, I had many books, and I read many books, and I went to many workshops, and I was trying to figure out what all of this was about. I wanted to know the answer. I wanted to figure out what the secret was about Buddhism so that I don't know if I wanted to become enlightened or not. But the idea is that, we talk about in Buddhism, some schools of Buddhism talk about that you go through many different lifetimes. You go through the samsaric lifestyle, you come back, and then at one point, at one life, then you're able to hear the Buddhist teachings and reach liberation. We've talked before about Jodo Shinshu being part of the Mahayana tradition, where instead of talking about enlightenment as much, we talk about the Buddha nature that is within all of us, and that our practice, so to speak, is for us to understand that the Buddha nature is already within us. And how do we acknowledge that? How do we see this? How do we see this in other people? And again, this idea of that a path that you follow that doesn't have the answers right away, that is something that you explore, that is a lifetime experience. So look, talking to Reverend Akahoshi this weekend, what was interesting is that for myself, and one of the things I like to share is that we talk about ondogyo, which means that we're all fellow travelers. And so sometimes people will see me, my name is Reverend Rai, I've got the robes, I've been ordained, I got my head shaved. And it seems like, oh, well, maybe Reverend Rai knew exactly what he was doing all this time with his Buddhist path. But no, I'm very human, like all of us are. And like Reverend Akahoshi, he and I would go back and forth. Do we really want to do this? What is the benefit of us wanting to go into the ministry? Is the point of sharing? And so I think, ironically, I got to go a few years before Reverend Akahoshi, but it was very inspiring for me to see him follow me, because what he did is he said, I have a specific idea of Shin teachings, which I'll discuss here very briefly. I would not want to try to summarize Reverend Akahoshi's thought, which he's publishing a book, by the way, that he just finished writing. And we'll definitely let everybody know when he publishes that book. But talking about the idea of Buddhism being contemporary in the sense that it's relevant for our way that we think right now. One of my senpais, one of my mentors many years ago, hated the word contemporary Buddhism. And I go, well, Sensei, what's wrong with contemporary? He said, the Dharma is timeless. The Dharma there is no contemporary idea. And I can understand, it's a universal truth that comes back from over the centuries from what Shakyamuni discovered. However, for us living in our circumstance, our country, our language of origin, being Americans, being in the United States of America, et cetera, and forgive me for those that might be on Zoom from other places. But the idea is that we do have to acknowledge that we are not in the same situation as what Shakyamuni Buddha was 2,600 years ago. I was at, on Memorial Day, I went to a friend's house and we had dinner, and there's quite a few friends, and the conversation was, okay, everybody at the table, pick the person that you would like to speak to the most. And it could be a historical person. Doesn't have to be somebody that's living. And so everybody's looking at me because here is the Buddhist minister. And so one of the people across the table is a very devout Catholic. And so he said, I would really like to meet Moses. And he explained why he would like to meet Moses and what he would ask. And then I brought up somebody else besides the Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha. And they go, as a Buddhist, why wouldn't you want to meet the historical Buddha? And I explained that meeting somebody from such a different time and from such a different culture and the cultural barrier, it would be a very confusing meeting. And the person got offended with me. They said, oh, you sound very, how do they say, arrogant, that you think that the Buddha would not be able to communicate with you. And I said, no, you misunderstand. I said, the Buddha represents enlightenment itself. He represents the Buddhist teachings. Of course, that is the ultimate pure form. But talking to a person from the Indian subcontinent from 2,600 years ago would be very difficult and would not be what we expect. Even in our lifetimes, we look at what we expect the Buddha to be. When I was serving the Fresno Temple, I taught the Metta Award, which is the class on for Cub Scouts. I challenge any of you to teach about 8-year-olds about Buddhism, 8-year-old boys. They always had to be something physical. I mean, we always had to ring the gong or do something, and they would ask the wildest questions. And so we were in a library in the old temple downtown, and the Obutsudan that was in the office had a statue, and the statue had been exposed to incense for many, many years. He actually had turned dark. And so one of the boys looked at me and says, oh, the Buddha, he's black. The Buddha's not black, is he? And I said, well, do you think that the Buddha is Japanese? Of course the Buddha is Japanese. No, the Buddha historically is not Japanese. And even for this 8-year-old discussion, it was very rewarding because we talked about what is a Buddha. And so getting back to my friend saying I was arrogant because maybe that I would be confused by meeting him as a person, it's like the understanding and the transmission of the Dharma has evolved over the centuries. It has evolved. That's why there's so many schools. That's why we have different schools and different practices. My father, who was an engineer and tended to think very logically, said to me, well, what is the essence of Buddhism? And that his belief was that the essence would never change from the beginning of the teachings to the present time. And I said, Dad, in my opinion, and of course it was at the breakfast table, I've mentioned this before, my dad would pop these Buddhist questions on me at 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's too early to talk about Buddhism, Dad. And then so and he says, I would say, Dad, to me, the teachings, the spiritual tradition is like a language, is that it evolves, it changes, that it's artificial if you try not to let it evolve and change. And so for us native English speakers, I remember in school they tried to have us read Robinson Crusoe, and you're like, how it's like this old style English, and we could read it, but didn't touch our heart. And I tried to express that to my dad. And so the idea of that, that the Buddhist teachings have changed over time and have evolved for enable us to hear them. And getting back to Reverend Akahoshi, again, with his modern view, and again, I do not want to oversimplify his thought, but what he talks about is that, that what he says, instead of saying the Nembutsu, he talks about the idea of saying thank you. So when you say the Nembutsu, he said, and you'll probably hear him say, Reverend Akahoshi will say, well, if I say abracadabra, what does that mean to you? And he says, if I say Namo Amida Butsu, what does that mean to you? But if I say thank you, you're acknowledging the presence of the Dharma in our life. We're acknowledging that the Buddha nature within each other, and talking about bringing back the idea of that, Amida Buddha, the Dharma, all of those things are already within us, within our own Buddha nature. So it was very rewarding to spend time with Dr. Akahoshi. We did have some very funny memories, and I'll share one memory really quick with you because I find this absolutely fascinating. So when we were going to the Institute of Buddhist Studies, we were studying under Professor Corliss, who was a world-renowned British scholar on Pure Land Buddhism. And he was very ill when we were studying with him. Kenji and I would go to his house because he was no able longer to go to the Institute of Buddhist Studies. So we go to his house and we would sit at his dining room table, and we would have class and we'd have lunch, and you have these very in-depth conversations. But some of the things that I remember very clearly is that if you went into his house, you go into his living room, and of course he's British, so he was raised in the Church of England. And so in one corner of the room was an altar with Christian iconography, crosses, etc. And on the other side was an obutsudan, like behind me, with the Buddhist scriptures. And so his understanding of it of Pure Land Buddhism was obviously very academic, but also very personalized. And this is just a little nice story I'd like to share, is that he had gone through surgery before we met him. He had many health issues, and he actually he died on the operating room table. And he shared the experience with us, and he goes, everybody talks about that you float above the table and you're looking down at yourself. And he says, and I did. I'm looking down at myself, and I was very much at peace. And he says, and then I saw the light, like everybody talks about. I followed the light, and in my mind, I knew I was going to the Pure Land. And Dr. Akahoshi and I are like, wow, this is really interesting. And so he goes down. Now you have to remember, he's not Japanese or Japanese American, he's British. And so he says, I go to the Pure Land, and it looked like a Monet painting. He says, there are these women walking around in Victorian dresses, these Caucasian women. And I knew I was in the Pure Land. I was totally at comfort, and I could hear the teachings of the Buddha. And I thought, what a fascinating story, because it was his life experience, that the idea that we have, the Pure Land looks like this place, like our Butsudans, our Onaijins represent the traditional view of what the Pure Land is like. But in his mind, he felt that calmness, he followed the light, and his view was it was a countryside with these beautiful English women in their Victorian dresses. So again, getting back to this idea of like Kenji and myself looking at the Dharma, trying to understand it in different interpretations, going back from the time of Shakyamuni to the present time, where the teachings are relevant for us, and that hopefully that we can find a flavor of the Dharma that agrees with us. And for those who are here tonight, I would hope that Jodo Shinshu is the aji, or the flavor that benefits you the most. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to now have us do the group reading together. So if we could look at the pledge, please, if you could pull that up. Our pledge: breaking out of my shell, I will share a warm smile and speak gentle words, just like the kind Buddha. Not becoming lost in my greed, anger, and ignorance, I shall think and act with an open mind, just like the calm and peaceful Buddha. Not putting myself first, I will share in the joy and sadness of others, just like the compassionate Buddha. Realizing the gift of life I have received, I shall strive to live each day to its fullest, like the Buddha who tirelessly works to liberate all. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Datsu. Okay. All right. So if we could just do one more silent meditation. If you could please just sit in your chair, sit up straight with your feet on the floor and your shoulders relaxed. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Butsu.